Bug in a bottle.
Charles enjoyed spending time outdoors whenever the weather was nice. One quiet afternoon, the sun was shining warmly over his neighborhood, filling everything with a peaceful, golden light. A gentle breeze moved through the trees behind his house, making the leaves whisper softly to one another. Birds sang cheerful songs from the branches, while colorful butterflies floated gracefully from flower to flower. His backyard was not very large, but to Charles it was a wonderful little place. It had soft green grass, a few bushes, and an old wooden fence that had stood there for many years. Charles loved walking around his yard because he enjoyed discovering small, interesting things that most people never even noticed. Every walk felt like a tiny adventure. Sometimes he found unusual rocks, sometimes colorful feathers, and sometimes strange little insects hiding beneath the grass. Today, he had no idea that he was about to make his most surprising discovery yet. As Charles slowly explored the yard, his eyes suddenly caught something unusual lying near the old fence. A tiny flash of sunlight reflected from the object, making it sparkle among the green grass. Charles stopped walking. What could that be? He wondered quietly. Curiosity quickly took over. He walked closer, one careful step at a time, keeping his eyes fixed on the mysterious object. Finally, he reached it. Charles found a glass bottle. He bent down slowly and carefully picked it up. The bottle felt cool and smooth in his hands. It seemed old, very old, as if it had been resting there for many years. Charles turned it gently from side to side. He wondered how it ended up in his backyard. Had someone forgotten it long ago? Had it rolled there from somewhere else? Or had it been waiting all this time for someone to discover it? He looked around the yard. There were no other bottles nearby. Nothing else seemed unusual. The quiet backyard suddenly felt different, almost mysterious. Charles smiled. It felt as though he had uncovered a tiny secret hidden in plain sight. He continued examining the bottle carefully. It was a pretty glass bottle. The afternoon sunlight passed through the thick glass, creating beautiful reflections that danced across the grass below. Even though the bottle looked old, it still sparkled beautifully. Its simple shape, its smooth surface, and the way it caught the sunlight made it seem surprisingly special. Charles couldn't stop looking at it. Then he noticed something else. The bottle wasn't clear. It was dark green. The rich green color reminded Charles of deep forests and tall pine trees standing silently beneath the summer sky. He slowly lifted the bottle toward the sunlight. As the light shone through the glass, the bottle glowed with a beautiful green light. For just a moment, it almost looked magical. Charles held the dark green bottle close to his face. He wanted to discover its secret. Slowly, he tilted the bottle one way, then the other. The sunlight shone through the glass, but the dark green color made it difficult to see anything inside. Charles narrowed his eyes. He looked as carefully as he could. Still, he couldn't see anything. "I wonder what's inside," he whispered to himself. His curiosity grew stronger with every passing second. Perhaps there was a tiny stone inside, maybe an old coin. Or perhaps there was nothing there at all. Charles wasn't ready to give up. He stepped into a brighter patch of sunlight. Once again, he raised the bottle to his eyes. He turned it slowly, looking from every angle possible. But no matter what he tried, the inside remained hidden. The thick, dark glass refused to reveal its secret. A gentle pause. Charles frowned slightly. Something didn't seem right. The bottle felt a little heavier than an empty bottle should feel. There had to be something inside. He simply couldn't see it. For a moment, he stood quietly, thinking. Then, a simple idea came to his mind. If I can't see it, maybe I can hear it. Charles smiled. Very carefully, he shook the bottle. First, just a little. Nothing happened. So he shook it again, a little harder this time. Rattle. A tiny sound came from inside. Charles immediately stopped moving. His heart beat a little faster. He had definitely heard something. Whatever was inside the bottle was moving. He held the bottle perfectly still. The entire yard seemed to become silent. The birds, the breeze, everything faded into the background. Charles listened carefully, waiting, watching, wondering. A long, suspensive pause. Suddenly, something slipped toward the opening. Before Charles could react, something came out of the bottle. It happened so quickly that he almost dropped it. His eyes opened wide. He quickly stepped backward in surprise. What was that? He gasped. He had expected dust or maybe a tiny pebble, but this was completely unexpected. The tiny object fell gently through the air and landed softly on the grass below. Charles immediately looked down. His curiosity had now become complete amazement. Whatever had been hiding inside that mysterious bottle was now lying right at his feet. Charles slowly knelt down, his eyes fixed on the tiny object resting in the grass. For just a moment, it didn't move. The little object lay perfectly still, almost blending into the green blades of grass. Charles leaned in a little closer. Then something happened. The tiny object moved, just a little. Charles's eyes grew wide with surprise. "It isn't a pebble," he whispered. "It's alive." For a moment, it didn't move. The little object lay perfectly still, almost blending into the green blades of grass. Charles leaned in a little closer. Then something happened. The tiny object moved, just a little. Charles's eyes grew wide with surprise. "It isn't a pebble," he whispered. "It's alive." It was a bug, a very small bug, small enough to rest comfortably on one of Charles's fingers. Its tiny legs moved carefully across the ground, step by tiny step. Its delicate antennae gently waved back and forth, as though it were exploring this new world around it. Charles stayed perfectly still. He didn't want to frighten the little creature. Instead, he quietly watched it with curiosity. He had expected to find something ordinary inside the bottle, but finding a living insect? That was something he had never imagined. The little bug seemed calm. It wasn't running away. It simply continued exploring the grass, moving slowly and carefully. Charles smiled. There was something fascinating about watching such a tiny living creature. Very gently, he reached down with both hands. Charles picked up the bug. He was extremely careful. He wanted to make sure he didn't hurt its tiny body. The little bug remained peaceful. It didn't struggle. It simply rested quietly in Charles's hands. Charles smiled even more. He couldn't believe that something so small could make an ordinary afternoon feel like such an adventure. He looked at it, really looked at it. For the first time in his life, he noticed all the amazing little details that most people never stop to see. Its tiny legs, its small eyes, its delicate body, and the careful way it moved. Everything about it seemed interesting. Charles realized that even the smallest creatures could be wonderful if someone took the time to notice them. Then, something unexpected happened. The bug looked at Charles. For several quiet seconds, neither of them moved. It almost felt as if they were studying each other. Charles couldn't help smiling. Then he laughed softly. "Hello, little bug," he said in a warm, friendly voice. "I wonder how you ended up inside that bottle." Of course, the tiny bug didn't answer, but it continued facing Charles, its little antennae moving gently. For one funny moment, it almost seemed as though the tiny creature was just as curious about Charles as Charles was about it. The quiet afternoon suddenly felt filled with wonder. One curious boy and one tiny bug sharing a peaceful moment together. Charles looked down at the dark green bottle, still resting quietly on the soft grass. He carefully lowered his hands. He didn't want to keep the tiny bug any longer than necessary. Charles believed that every living creature, no matter how small, deserved the freedom to choose where it wanted to go. Very slowly, he bent down. Charles put the bottle back on the ground. He placed it gently, making sure it wouldn't roll away. For a moment, he simply looked at it. The old bottle sat peacefully in the afternoon sunlight, its dark green glass glowing softly beneath the warm sky. Then Charles turned his attention back to the tiny bug. It remained calm, resting quietly in his hands. Charles smiled. "I think it's time for you to decide where you want to go." Soft pause. Very carefully, Charles leaned closer to the grass. He slowly opened his hands. He put the bug on the ground, next to the bottle. The tiny insect stood perfectly still. It didn't crawl away. It didn't hide beneath the grass. It simply remained where Charles had placed it. Its tiny antennae moved slowly from side to side, as if it were thinking, or searching, or remembering something. Charles stayed completely quiet. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He wanted to see what the little creature would choose to do. Several long seconds passed. The gentle breeze continued to move through the trees. Birds sang somewhere in the distance. Everything around them felt peaceful. Then, the tiny bug began to move. Very slowly, it crawled across the grass. Charles watched every tiny step. At first, he thought it was simply wandering away. But then he noticed something surprising. The bug wasn't moving away from the bottle. It was moving toward it. Charles leaned forward in amazement. "Really?" he whispered. The tiny insect reached the bottle. Without stopping, without hesitating, it climbed toward the narrow opening. Its tiny legs gripped the smooth glass until, little by little, it disappeared inside. The bug crawled back into the bottle. Charles blinked in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. The little creature had been free. It could have gone anywhere. Yet, somehow, it had chosen to return to the mysterious dark green bottle. Charles couldn't stop wondering why. What made the bottle so special? What secret did it hold for the tiny bug? The answers remain the mystery. Charles stood quietly, his eyes resting on the dark green bottle. For several long moments, he didn't move at all. He simply watched the bottle lying peacefully on the soft green grass. The afternoon breeze continued to whisper through the trees. Birds sang happily above him. Butterflies floated lazily from flower to flower. It was the very same backyard, the very same peaceful afternoon. Yet somehow, everything felt a little different now. Charles smiled. Just a few minutes earlier, he had been taking an ordinary walk around his yard. He hadn't expected anything unusual. He certainly hadn't expected to discover an old green bottle or meet a tiny little bug hiding inside it. And he never imagined that the bug would choose to crawl right back into the bottle. The whole experience felt strange, but in the nicest possible way. Charles realized that not every mystery has an answer. Sometimes it's perfectly okay not to understand everything. Some questions remain unanswered, and that is part of what makes the world so interesting. He looked around his yard once more. The soft grass, the old wooden fence, the flowers, the trees. They were exactly as they had always been. But now, Charles noticed them with fresh eyes. He understood that wonderful discoveries don't always happen in distant places. Sometimes they happen right outside your own back door. Before going inside, Charles took one last look at the bottle. He decided to leave it exactly where it was. Perhaps the little bug truly felt safe there. Perhaps that old bottle had become its tiny home. Charles didn't want to disturb it again. He gave the bottle one final smile, then quietly turned and walked toward the house. As he reached the door, he glanced back one last time. The bottle rested peacefully in the afternoon sunlight, its dark green glass glowing softly, holding its quiet little secret. That simple afternoon became a memory Charles would never forget. Whenever he walked through his backyard after that day, he paid closer attention to the little things around him. A tiny flower, a colorful butterfly, a singing bird, or even a small bug. Each one reminded him that the world is full of surprises. Sometimes the greatest adventures don't begin with something big. Sometimes they begin with a single step, a curious mind, and the courage to stop, look closely, and wonder. Because if we stay curious and pay attention to the small things, we may discover that ordinary days can become extraordinary memories.